Welcome to this presentation on the Eucharist, where we're going to look at some very essential elements and other basics. The first thing is the matter and the form. The matter is wheat bread and grape wine. It must be wheat and it must be grape. We'll also talk about how there is a minimum amount of gluten that is needed for the bread and a minimum amount of alcohol that is needed for the wine. We'll also look at the details of the epiclesis prayer, which we saw in baptism and confirmation, and the kind of longer Eucharistic prayer that is said at Mass in order to consecrate the Eucharist. We'll also look in greater detail at Christ's real presence. And by real presence, we mean that the bread and the wine actually become the body, blood, soul, and divinity of Christ. Historically, the term that's been used to describe this is transubstantiation. That means the changing of the substance. And here, substance is an ancient philosophical term that refers to the whole reality of a thing. We do not mean, what is that pile of dirt over there? What is that substance? Substance now has a kind of very basic elemental physical science reference to any material. But here, substance is more the philosophical term of the whole reality. And so we mean that the whole reality of bread and wine is completely changed. It's different. It's now body, blood, soul, and divinity of Christ. However, we admit it still looks like wine and bread. It still tastes like wine and bread. Well, that's because the accidental properties, the appearances, the things that we can sense with our five senses, those stay the same. Because those are accidental properties. Those are not what get at the whole reality of a thing like bread, wine, or even a human person or a divine person like Christ. So the substance changes, but the accidental properties stay the same. Now, because we believe in the real presence, because the real presence is a truth, we act in certain ways around the Eucharist. First of all, we adore the Eucharist. If we worship Christ and Christ is in the Eucharist, then we worship the Eucharist. Also, because Christ is in the Eucharist, we reserve the Eucharist in the tabernacle. Anything that's left over at Mass, we consume the wine and we reserve the precious body in the tabernacle. And also, we reverence the Eucharist. We genuflect before the tabernacle and we bow profoundly before the Eucharist whenever we receive it. We also bow profoundly or go down on two knees if the Eucharist is exposed and say something like adoration. There are some certain requirements to receive the Eucharist. First of all, you must be a baptized member of the Catholic Church to receive the Eucharist, but also you must receive it worthily by, one, believing in the real presence of Christ in the Eucharist, and, of course, transubstantiation, which is the cause of it. We also must be free from grave sin. If we receive the Eucharist in a state of mortal sin, it is itself another grave sin to commit that act. And we also must fast 1 hour from food and drink in order to receive the Eucharist. The ordinary ministers of the Eucharist, so only a validly ordained priest or bishop, obviously, can preside at the Eucharist to basically consecrate the Eucharist. The bishop is always responsible for the consecration of the Eucharist within his diocese. And a deacon can assist at the liturgy, but he cannot preside at the sacrament. That's why if a deacon's the only one that's present at a Mass, there is no Mass, there is no Eucharist. We can only have a celebration, but we cannot have a Mass or the consecration of the Eucharist. But when it comes to distribution of communion, that's called the communion rite, to the faithful, the bishop and the priest are typically responsible for distributing the body via the plate, the paten, and the deacon is typically responsible for distributing the precious blood in the chalice. The extraordinary ministers of Holy Communion are not like baptism, the people who can baptize in danger of death or the people who in emergency can confirm. The extraordinary minister of Holy Communion is just someone who can be designated to give the Eucharist to someone. So that's the laity, and they can only distribute Eucharist at Mass, only when it's necessary. They can also be designated to take the Eucharist to someone who is not able to make it to Mass. That's all they can do. They can't consecrate the Eucharist or do anything like that. They can only distribute in a time of necessity.